Well, not quite Guns N' Roses, but that might have woken you up. And good morning. Thank you for coming so early. We are going to start off with the very exciting title of Building Effective DevSecOps Teams Through Role-Playing Games. In order to do this, we're going to need a map. We're going to need some miniatures, and we're going to need some dice. Now, did anybody bring dice? No? No dice. That's okay. We'll do some live-action role-playing then. Live-action role-playing is when you can, for example, dress up like vampires, run around buildings, and instead of having dice, your method of conflict resolution was rock, paper, and scissors, which, quite honestly, I think is a quite logical way of doing conflict resolution. Of course, with live-action role-playing games, role-playing exercises, some of you might actually be even familiar with them already, whether you have a military background, whether you're doing them with incident response, or so on. There's actually quite a long history of tabletop exercises in wargaming. But we'll touch on that a little bit at the end. But first, I wanted to highlight one of the important aspects of them, which is the human aspect. Yesterday, we heard some fantastic presentations about infrastructure as code, about building security controls within our cloud environments. All very important, very key to scaling. But one of the things that we shouldn't lose sight of is that we're actually working with people, and we're also working for people as we build these systems. So, as a precursor, I do still want to highlight that in my heart of hearts, automation I recognize as key to the modern DevOps movements, as well as just it makes our lives easier. By being able to say development and operations are sharing the pain, as well as sharing the responsibility of not only building code, but maintaining it and deploying it. Those are really good ways of bringing teams together and building the idea that everybody has ownership of what they're building. So automation is important. So nothing what I say today, hopefully, will convey the idea that automation should be dismissed or automation is failing us in some way. What I'm trying to highlight is that security angle. That yes, we're building applications with people, meaning we've moved on, hopefully, from the idea that the security team is the sheriff saying, thou shalt not do this, or thou shalt come to me before you can release this application. We want to work with them, work with the DevOps teams. And one of the things that I'll highlight as well, threat modeling. We had some great conversations and great presentations yesterday about threat models, ways to scale them, ways to automate them. We also want to make sure that we remember people in them. And to go back in time a little bit, in the late 1999, I was busy having some meaningful Dungeons & Dragons campaigns, while other people were doing some meaningful research on usability. So this is quite, I think, an important and formative paper, Why Johnny Can't Encrypt. Essentially saying, we have PGP. The math is pretty fantastic. We have mechanisms where we can encrypt email, send and receive encrypted email. It's pretty resistant to integrity issues, pretty resistant to confidentiality issues, but the availability issues were pretty weak, mostly in the sense of the usability of the system. And was trying to go beyond the idea that if we're just saying users are stupid, or developers are lazy, or developers don't care about security, we might be actually missing what the real issue here is that, sure, we have some fancy math and important math behind PGP, but maybe we're failing the users. And if we're calling them stupid or we're calling them lazy, we're essentially building up our own fantasy campaign setting where users and developers are aren't as smart as we are, or aren't as good as we are. So this is what I wanted to turn our attention to: role-playing games. I think it's a pretty effective metaphor in the sense that it's about collaborative storytelling. It's about a group of people working towards a shared goal. Now, the shared people may have a few different motivations in how they get to that goal, but it's still a shared goal. And DevOps teams, security teams, of course, still have shared goals of meeting sprints, meeting certain milestones, meeting certain compliance requirements, and so on. But another important thing I also wanted to highlight, too, is because it's collaborative and because it's storytelling, it also requires a lot of communication exercises. And while we have a lot of things like the OWASP Top 10, we have the CWE, we have lists and tables and so on, of all kinds of technical controls or technical issues and weaknesses and risks, we don't really have the same type of lists, or at least the same shared lists when we're talking about communication and working with people. So of course, the first list I wanted to share is how this would map to our day-to-day jobs. Barbarians I put up there because barbarians at one point in D&D were actually illiterate. And if you've ever tried to read someone else's Perl code, for example, I think that's a pretty fair explanation there. And of course, the bards always just like to show off and have the attention. I'll just leave that as, again, an exercise for the audience. But I also want to say that our metaphor isn't quite perfect. So we can't just go around as a security team mandating what everyone should be doing. We need to move beyond those 90s of just use PGP for encrypting your email, or just go and deploy HTTPS. We had a lot of InfoSec conferences that would shame people, saying, look at all these websites not using HTTPS. Look at all these tools I can use for intercepting HTTP traffic or unencrypted traffic. It wasn't until 10 years ago, my math is a little bit off, where we had a tool, or we had a project like Let's Encrypt that twisted that a little bit and said, rather than just blaming and shouting doom and gloom that no one's encrypting their websites, let's actually give some DevOps teams a way to have certificates for free and an ACME protocol to make it easy to manage them. So not only can they obtain a certificate, but they can manage the life cycle of it. So in these live-action role-playing games, like I mentioned, the rock, paper, scissors, you could also walk around with your arms out and be majestic, and people would listen to you, which I'm lucky enough I don't have to do that because I look silly doing so, and you're also listening to me because you kindly came to this conference. But we want to move beyond that. We want to build up our shared vocabulary of how we're going to talk with people, build empathy, which I think is quite important, as well as acknowledge or tease out some ideas. What are threats to these types of exercises? So communication is pretty easy. The picture there is of a gelatinous cube. That is a famous D&D monster that is a 10 by 10 foot cube that you can't see and is a great threat to adventurers as they walk down corridors. But what that really means is I didn't have a good metaphor other than to say, look out, there's a gelatinous cube here. But what we're really trying to say is communication is also about active listening. It's about, rather than just saying, go forth and, why aren't you deploying HTTPS? Go turn on HTTPS. PCI requires HTTPS. It's also listening, what are the problems that people are having to deploy that? Why is obtaining a certificate something that is a budget item that people are dealing with? There's also simpler exercises, and these are simpler things like just one-on-one exercises, acknowledging that you heard something. This is especially true when you're repeating vulnerability information that might come in from a bug bounty program, trying to explain this is what the actual risk is of this cross-site scripting vulnerability, or here is what this weird logic bug means, or this is why this vulnerability is a problem, and then figuring out, are the developers you're talking with actually understanding how you're explaining that, or are they missing the point? Either asking them to repeat back, or when they're saying, I understand what that solution is, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, repeating back to them and saying, I heard your approach is going to be adding some extra input validation, and you're going to blacklist this JavaScript : tag, but that might fail. A great example of this could be that discussion we saw yesterday about variant analysis and vulnerabilities. The idea of having that communication cycle that goes beyond just, here's a bug, go fix it, but actually taking the time to analyze, look into, and actually have something much shorter or more condensed than that 6-month cycle between, here's a bug report that wasn't necessarily acknowledged and no feedback was given in terms of what the fix was, and then having that extended of time of how it would be, what the solution should be. Empathy, I think, is a much more important aspect, or it's an emergent property of good communication, I'll say. It's essentially the idea of understanding where people are coming from, understanding that DevOps problem. Why don't we have HTTP deployed everywhere? What are the current sprint? What are the current features within a sprint? What are developers working on? This also comes into play, and I'll highlight some more concrete examples shortly when we talk about threat models and what people look like within our threat models. And speaking of threats, there is the classic, what alignment are you in D&D? One of the things I'd like to turn here is that the threats to communication are not mostly about people, it's about their behavior. There was a fantastic quote from an Australian a couple years ago who said, the standard you walk by is the standard you accept. And that kind of highlights the idea that threats to communication, threats to empathy are things that are behaviors. They're not actually people. Sure, somebody may be bad or they may be good, they may be lawful neutral or chaotic evil, but they may still have behaviors that are helpful, they still may be empathic, or they may be blaming the developers for being lazy. They may be blaming users for being stupid because they're clicking on a phishing link, things like that. The other thing is there's the concepts of erasure, essentializing. These essentially can be threats to small teams. The idea of erasure, not giving credit to when people are coming up with solutions, not sharing credit when people are coming up with solutions, or saying just taking someone and this is the single dimension of what they are. For example, having women in your meetings, or women who give presentations who are invited to solely speak about, you are women, therefore what is it like to be a woman in InfoSec, rather than what is the latest, coolest malware that you've been reverse engineering? What's the last stressful incident response that you were working on? Something that's relevant maybe to building an application, things like that. Two other points I want to make around this theme are that as developers, we read other people's code and we learn a lot from other people's code. What's the Pythonic way of walking through lists? Or what is the Go way of creating a loop? Well, we can do the similar thing with codes of conduct. So, and I highlight this in the sense of how can we learn, or what can we just do to educate ourselves and build awareness for ourselves about what are those standards of behavior or things that we would expect, and importantly, how do they define consequences, or how do they define a path for conflict resolution? In other words, something beyond just rolling some dice or playing rock, paper, scissors and figuring out what to do. One of the other things here is to tease out a little bit of a nuance between the idea of diversity and inclusivity. So diversity means a lot of people are showing up, and a lot of different people are showing up or participating in our DevOps team. Inclusivity means we're taking I think means we're taking a bit more active effort to make this a welcome environment where people want to come and participate. They want to come to a conference, they want to contribute to the Linux kernel, for example, or they want to contribute to a DevOps team, or an incident response team, a blue team, red team, and so on. In the spirit of providing additional resources, and again, a lot of what I'm describing is not something that I created on my own, as we saw why Johnny Can't Encrypt already from 1999. There's a fantastic website that I like called Captain Awkward. This is very much non-technical in the sense it's about social interactions and relationships, but if you'd ever like to read through, just as we read through other people's code to see how people code well, read how this site handles moderation. Read how this site handles conflict, how it handles feedback. It can be a great way to either pick and choose what are some of the behaviors that you want to model after, what are some things that might inspire you. So, trying to move along here at a bit of a fast pace, we're going to turn back now to some threat models and bring some people into these threat models. So I've been talking about D&D, but there's also cyberpunk. So the late 90s had some fantastic cyberpunk. This is from a game called Shadowrun. For those of you who don't know, cyberpunk was about, at the time, it was imagining things like mega corporations that were more powerful than countries, things like technology being a threat to our privacy, technology as addictive, technology as a tool of tyrants, things like that. So mostly probably an unrecognizable footnote by now, I'm sure. But the idea here is that there's a couple tropes within gaming: rolling for initiative, split the party, statues, and darkness. There's some metaphors we can pull out here. One, this idea of rolling for initiative. In games, combat happens. Combat can be kind of fun. D&D, for example, or modern D&D, calls out three major pillars: exploration, social interaction, which I'm trying to emphasize here, and a little bit of combat, which we'll talk about at the end. But the idea of rolling for initiative can be great for the meetings that we have on a daily, hopefully not too much, on a daily or weekly basis. The idea that once combat comes or when an event comes, everybody gets to participate. In other words, going around a room and avoiding the idea that here is the person who is most passionate, or here is a person who is most loud about making a decision, or especially something that will be a decision with many potential solutions, or a decision that's potentially controversial. The idea of rolling for initiative is handling meetings and saying, sure, one person has been loud, one person has been dominating, but have we gotten input from everyone within who is attending the meeting, especially the people that are potentially responsible for deploying changes or coding changes or following the decisions that have been made. We can also start to tease out again how these different metaphors can build into technology. So you have obviously things like abuse, also have things like denial of service against people. So there's a denial of service is often asymmetric resource exhaustion in the sense of bandwidth or CPU or memory resources. But as people, our personal time is also very important. So as we're building applications, mobile applications, web applications, are we starting to look at threat models and people or looking how that application can be abused in an asymmetric way? Meaning, it may take 100 people 1 second to send a DM to one person, but that one person is going to take possibly a lot longer than 1 second to delete a lot of abusive messages. That's an asymmetric cost of attention. So if you don't have a way to filter, you don't have a way to auto-delete, for example, or bulk delete, that's an area where you can still have a technical control that can address that sort of attack, or that sort of abuse. The idea of forced participation, being added to a list, being added to a GitHub repo of losers who played D&D in college, or something like that. It's the idea of here is that technical control of, can you opt in people, or do they have to opt out? Also the idea of threats, security that comes at a cost. This goes back to that let's encrypt model. And when everyone was calling out websites and naming and shaming websites for not deploying HTTPS, a lot of websites didn't have revenue. A lot of websites couldn't pay for HTTPS certificates or TLS certificates. So security as a cost can still be a threat, especially if you're saying security as a cost must come from an iPhone versus an Android phone, which have, depending on the maker of the Android phone, has different security models around it. And of course, there's also the idea of privacy. I have a couple more I want to go through. I'll get into some more details. But there's some other things that can emerge out of here, some other concepts to consider in your threat modeling, is what about asymmetric features? I wanted to use asymmetric a second time, so that's why I called this out. But to explain that a little bit more, think of chat mechanisms. Chat mechanisms, communication within apps are very helpful, very important. Many companies have gone all in on Slack, for example. So that is a great example of having communication. But there are games, for example, that love chat systems that are quite open, that have voice chat. There are other games that minimize the interaction. So look at the difference between having a Discord server where people can talk to each other while playing World of Warcraft versus how people would interact with a game like Hearthstone. Hearthstone, if you're not familiar, basically it's an online card-playing game, and you have a predefined list of, I think, maybe 8 or 10 different phrases or ways of interacting with someone else. You can basically say, good job, or I'm going to get you, or things like that. But by boiling this down to a finite way of interacting, you're also minimizing chances for abuse between different populations of players, whether they're very different between age, so 10-year-old kids versus 40-year-olds playing with them, people who want to smack talk versus those who don't. So that's an example of having a feature that can, or going through threat models and understanding who is our user population. Is it going to be a group of like-minded people that are opting in and wanting to have this type of communication and unmoderated and wide open chat? Or do we have quite a broad range of users from children to adults, and we don't necessarily want to be able to mix those particular interactions because it's just not appropriate or it opens up to abuse. There's also things like unexpected design. And one of the things of unexpected design is this as simple as the verified by Twitter. So essentially, Twitter said, all we mean by this little blue check mark is that we verified the identity of this account. That this account probably belongs to this guy named Mike because we've done some checks. But what that created from, and if you think of it from sort of that behavioral economics perspective, this little blue check mark was something special. And it was a scarce resource. Not everyone had them. So suddenly, it's a sign of prestige. And as a sign of prestige, it's also kind of implied as a sign of endorsement. It doesn't matter as much that Twitter, for example, was just saying, no, this is just means what we're verifying. That's all this means. But the user population then came and said, well, that's what you mean, but this is how we're using it. This is how we're reacting to it. So that's, I think, a great example of what unexpected or emergent design comes out of the features that you have. And there's also an unexplored future of what augmented and virtual reality attack vectors might be. So imagine all the abuse that we possibly had if you've worked in with email or in photo apps or any apps that handle images, and the idea of how the different types of porn or other types of abusive images that can come in with that static environment. AR and VR might introduce whole new realms and methods of abuse. And so it's an area that I think, I'm throwing out there as an area to be aware of that requires more investigation on my own part, as well possibly within the industry to understand what those threat models would actually be. Now, trying to highlight a couple more concrete examples too to try to drive this home. One of the things is that I started this conversation about DevSecOps, meaning put security within that working with development and operations, that DevOps team. If your organization has groups with called trust and safety or privacy, those are also fantastic aspects, and those are that DevOps mentality should and could also work with your trust and safety, because there could be things that, at the very least, from a threat modeling exercise, understanding how do ratings work within your application. Are they appropriate? Do they work against the users or can they work for them? For example, ride sharing. With ride sharing like Lyft and Uber, not only can you give a rating of the driver, drivers can also rate passengers. But there's potential abuse for this rating system. You might imagine how you can abuse it for drivers, but abuse for riders could be something as simple as, here is someone who has an impediment to walking, walks slower, or has mobility issues, slower to get into cars. Maybe they'll get downrated because drivers are impatient, don't want to work for them, or don't want to deal with them because they want to try to maximize their cost. What if the rider is a woman and the driver is flirting with them, saying, oh, where are you going? You just finished your night of clubbing, what's your number? And woman finds that unwelcome or just doesn't want to engage or simply just wants to have a quiet ride. They may get downrated simply for being cold or not responding to quote-unquote friendly flirtation or just somebody being nice. Those are small examples, but those are still examples of how ratings can be abused. On the grand picture, you may argue that the ratings will be averaged out over time, that if you take a lot of trips, that doesn't matter. But in that moment, it surely doesn't feel good to receive that feedback or that critical rating, especially when it's a part of the app that's acknowledging that. There's also, of course, the ideas of threat modeling and privacy. The GDPR, of course, since May 25th, when everybody was getting all of their email barrage of updated privacy notices, There's important aspects of not just the OWASP top 10 and security controls like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, remote code execution, but what's the data actually being operated on within this application? What is the metadata of this? Early on, a lot of applications that were dealing with photos made sure to strip metadata out of the photo, especially the metadata about location, because otherwise it was quite easy to see who was posting pictures and where those pictures coming from. More recently, we saw interesting metadata leaks around Fitbit and similar devices, where I believe this was again an Australian who was going through some anonymized and aggregated data about Fitbit users and was able to correlate them to places in the desert or places in remote areas that just so happened to coincide with the outlines of military bases. So that was a pretty interesting metadata leak. It wasn't a single person in this case saying that this is Bob or Sally that's running around this particular base, but it was an aggregation of all these people that was still a leak about here's a location that's actually quite sensitive, as well as here's the times associated with that. So again, there's a lot of things to consider in our threat models and what are we actually looking at. We can also, and one of the things that I wanted to still emphasize is there's a lot of design and dev that we can still do within all of this effort. We can still have DevSecOps. So if we think of location data, so GPS, how coarse should it be? Do we really need something down to the meter, or so I do this for meter because I'm American and I don't understand what meters are, I apologize. But do we need it only down to a kilometer? What's the business purpose of our app that we actually need location data for? What about where the data is stored? Or do we need the actual data, or do we just need some binary indicator? For example, let's imagine we have an app that's just looking to see, tracking when has someone entered this code node. And when they enter it, we can pop up an augmented reality or something like that. That's a very binary question. To answer that question, we don't necessarily need to track on a second-by-second basis what are the GPS coordinates of somebody's phone right now, down to the meter. We don't need to send that data off to the server. We just need to be able to compare and say, is this latitude and longitude within what we've defined as this building, or is it not? And if all we're saying from a DevSecOps or a DevPrivOps kind of approach, saying just track that binary indicator, am I inside this region or outside this region, then we're actually not collecting all of this potentially sensitive GPS data that we can track where I walked from my hotel, past Moorgate Station, finally into this room, because that's unnecessary for that imagined app, how that would need to work. So one of the things I also wanted to call out is this idea of, as I was explaining, considering users within our threat models, considering how the application can be abused and how the application can have asymmetric effects on users. It goes back to that idea of, are we really blaming developers or blaming users for mistakes they've made, or are we failing to design them into our applications? In 1990, I can't read my, there's at the bottom here, but there's a link here to a paper from Microsoft that was talking about ceremonies. Now the idea of ceremonies, here we are, 2007. The idea of ceremonies was saying that we have a protocol, we have the ideas of protocols. TCP is a protocol. The joke about, there's a UDP joke that no one will ever get. Think about it for a moment. But those are all systems. And those are all, how do systems talk together? How does software talk together? What the gentleman from Microsoft did was say, let's also model people as nodes within this system. And we'll call these, instead of protocols, we'll call them ceremonies. So now, as within a ceremony, we're going to start to reason, how does a user obtain their initial password? How do we do something like TOFU, trust on first use? How do we distribute private keys for PGP? How do we exchange private keys for PGP? Those, rather than hand-waving them and just saying, just go and do this out of band, that's what the protocol says. What the ceremony says is, how do we model users in this system? What are the actions we expect them to take? And have we hopefully designed the application in a way that these actions can be done by default in a safe manner, or that the UX, the user experience, is designed to encourage the correct or a more safe behavior? Or are we just popping up that little certificate failure error that says, click here to continue, that everyone is going to click here to continue anyway and ignore whether that certificate is valid? So that's that idea of having ceremonies and modeling people. Now, the caveat here, of course, is that modeling people is a little bit difficult. And people are pretty complex, and people are hard to predict, of course. But by at least starting to consider them and starting to say we have a protocol for this application, or this is how our application, the system components of our application, having a ceremony and bringing people into them is what's important. And this comes back to that idea of one of my favorite tropes from role-playing games, attacking the darkness. So these would be threats against ceremonies, that we have some ambiguity in design, that we're just designing a protocol and we're forgetting the user completely, or that we're assuming a uniform user. We're assuming that this game is only going to be used by a certain type of user that likes to engage in quite loud, quite clever, quite whatever adjective you want, but smack talk or trash talking within the game. Or it has that group of that population of users, but also has another population of users that are young kids, 10-year-old kids that want to play. So what are the different threat models that can be, that our application is exposing them to? So, and want to do a couple examples of how to try to also say, can we measure this? Because that's one of the important things, is we don't want to just build a protocol and do some linters to say our protocol works. We want to actually have a ceremony and figure out, is our ceremony working? And one of the things we can do to hopefully measure, to see if that's working, is build a story or measure this. Four things I like to consider in building the story is we want to make sure we're asking or starting from something that's relevant. We want to then, because we want to make a decision based on it, or we want this to say we're succeeding or we're failing. We want to gather some data. We want to make sure we don't have tunnel vision, and we want to have a simple story, but we don't want to over-embellish our story or make up something about it that doesn't work. So here is an example of metrics that I took from some data I had access to about the average number of days it took to fix vulnerabilities, and then which vulnerabilities were quicker to be resolved and which ones took longer than average. So in this case, remote code execution was fixed in far fewer days than average, and redirects and forwards took a lot longer than average to fix. So again, in the idea of a story, this probably resonates pretty well. If you look at the OWASP top 10, the 2014 version had redirects and forwards. The most recent 2017 version dropped it off completely. And remote code execution has that implied high risk, high impact type of vulnerability, so it's probably a good thing that people are fixing that very quickly. But there's additional things that we could do to question this and make sure that we have good data, meaning that we're not getting tunnel vision and just assuming our data looks good. It could be that redirects and forwards, rather than being low risk, may be more complex to fix. Maybe they require more network re-architecting. Maybe they're more difficult because this is how a particular application is intended to work. So that's why I just want to call out in the spirit of avoiding having too much of a narrow focus on metrics. Another type of thing a threat to avoid on metrics is that idea of leaderboards. So games have leaderboards. Leaderboards have many valid uses. Bug bounties, for example, are great examples of leaderboards. These are individuals who are competing with each other to find the most bugs, and probably more interestingly, get the most money off of those bugs. In this case, this is a leaderboard in a sense for pen testers, because in a lot of my day-to-day work, I work with pen testers. And what I did was I figured out, I looked at who was reporting findings from pen tests. I found that 50% of the findings came from 15% of the pen testers. So if we have maybe a room like this, 100 people in it, only 15 people are doing supposedly half of the work. But here's an example of metrics that are probably going to fail us, because for possibly a couple reasons. One, a pen testing team typically is collaborative. They're working towards shared goal, for example. So the person who reports the vulnerability may have been collaborating and talking with the other people on the team in order to figure out, is this exploitable or what's the risk here? The other thing is that findings aren't the only measure of a good pen test. Obviously, we want to know when there's vulnerabilities there, but we also want to know and collect feedback, constructive feedback, about what is our app doing that's doing well. What's well designed, where's something that has that's resilient to a particular type of app or attack. Maybe we couldn't get all of our cross-site scripting exploits working because they had really good content security policy. So here's an example of just working with people and avoiding measuring people on a single dimension that's actually not reflective of what we want to get out of them. In this sense, we want to get out of our pen testers a collaborative atmosphere, meaning that they work together on reporting these vulnerabilities. And we also want to find out more than just what's wrong with this application. We'd also like to know what's good with it. So again, here's just a couple of other examples of threats, and the idea of threat modeling are the metrics we collect. And one of the things I want to call out too is cognitive biases. So I highly encourage following this link to read more about different cognitive biases that not only affect the metrics we collect and how we use them, but the different ways we interact with people, the different ways we work with people. Because one of the things that I want to highlight is that what we measure reflects what we care about. What we care about reflects the environment we're building. So if we're just building a leaderboard of pen testers and who finds the most vulnerabilities, we may be losing out on people who are working effectively with developers and explaining how to fix problems. We may be losing out on the people who are more collaborative and just overemphasizing people who are less collaborative and just want to find and work on their own and find vulnerabilities. The same would be true of who makes the most Git commits. Making the most Git commits isn't necessarily the best developer. Do they have a lot of testing? Are they making meaningful commits? In other words, some features may only need a few lines of code, but maybe there's a lot of reasoning, there's a lot of design work, there's a lot of thinking that goes into it. There's also potentially a lot of documentation that goes into those commits. So that's one of those things that doesn't necessarily get reflected. So wrapping up, wanted to also call out the idea that for as much as I love role-playing games, I think, are a good metaphor or a good way to exercises we could adopt. Play games with your coworkers, play games with your friends, but they haven't been perfect themselves. We as DevOps or we as security teams have our social group. We at a conference are a social group. In our company, we're social groups. Even just in a meeting on a small, 5 to 10 people is a social group. There's always threats to them. There's always cliques. There's always those ideas of gatekeeping. And we have to be, or we should be, at least cognizant, or at least have a vocabulary to be able to call out what those types of threats would be. And if we have a vocabulary to be able to identify and talk about them, then we can recognize that maybe this is a problem, or maybe this is something that we want to overcome. So we can also then, more concretely, rather than playing, go fighting some mind flayers and doppelgangers, we could actually work on some tabletop exercises themselves. So the military, for example, has done wargaming exercises for a long time. You may have your incident responders and blue teams within your organizations may already have their own tabletop exercises. A simple scenario may be something like the secretaries get picked on a lot, so I won't pick on secretaries. We'll say a developer clicks on a phishing link and the developer's laptop is compromised. This is an exercise now, a tabletop exercise for an incident response team. For a DevOps team or a DevSecOps team, this might be another type of scenario you could come up. Here's a tabletop exercise for you. CTO says, go forth, give me some better analytics. DevOps team member says, awesome. I'll just export this production DB into this third-party, business intelligence tool. We'll do a proof of concept for it. Hey, everyone, come check this out. Let me know what these dashboards look like. And oops, by the way, there's some password hashes in there. So as an exercise, this potentially calls out a couple of problems, or maybe not problems, within your organization. What does the chain of command or the decision-making effort look like this? How about moving production data into a third party? Having password hashes that are moved out there as well. There's a lot of conversations that can come out of this, and as a DevSecOps, you can bring people together to do this. You can create some relevant scenarios. Go and attack the objective of that scenario rather than the scenario itself. Rather than saying, my CTO knows better, run with it. What if the CTO did this? Do we have conversations? Do you have things in place to be able to handle this, to be able to react to it? And collect feedback on those ceremonies, on the people and processes you have within your organization, as well as get feedback on how you're running these tabletop exercises. Your IR team probably has done a lot of these. Have the DevSecOps team go through this. These tabletop exercises are essentially larger, more grandiose threat models. So, as we wind down to the last few seconds, I had to throw in my final joke. What was the emphasis about what this whole presentation was about is that applications are made by people, applications are made for people, and in a way, yes, applications are made of people. Now, one final quote I want to leave you with. There's a famous Englishman who embodied the spirit of live-action role-playing, and as he once said, we could be heroes just for one day. So let's try to make that day last a long time, play some games, and have fun. Thank you. Now, I realize I talked all the way up because I wanted to avoid questions, which actually isn't true. I talked all the way up because I had a lot of slides. I'm not sure if we have time for questions or we'll have to run away. I haven't been waved off yet, so I will take a drink while we go find questions.
Any questions? Any questions?
Questions?
Okay.
No questions?
Not this time. Well, thanks very much, Mike.
Thank you, everyone.